Good evening, my friend. Come in. The fire is warm tonight, and there's always a place waiting for you beside it. Before we begin, take a slow, comfortable breath. Allow the day to quietly drift away. There's nothing you need to finish tonight, nothing you need to solve, nowhere else you need to be. For the next little while, there is only the warmth of the fire, the sound of a quiet voice, and a journey into another time. Tonight, we travel nearly 2,000 years into the past, not to follow an emperor, not to witness a great battle, not to stand before mighty monuments. Instead, we will spend a peaceful day beside an ordinary Roman baker, a man whose mornings began before sunrise, whose hands carried the scent of flour, and whose bread welcomed an entire neighborhood every single day. History often remembers kings, but it was ordinary people who quietly built the world. So, make yourself comfortable. Close your eyes whenever they become heavy, and if sleep finds you somewhere along the way, then our journey has done exactly what it was meant to do. The fire is ready, Rome is still sleeping, and our story begins now. The deepest hours of the night belonged to the baker. Long before the first hint of morning appeared above the eastern horizon, while most of Rome still dreamed beneath dark tiled roofs, he opened his eyes without the help of a bell or servant. Years of routine had become his clock. The city outside was almost silent. No merchants called from the streets. No wagons rattled across the worn stone roads. Even the neighborhood dogs had settled into sleep. Only an occasional breeze slipped through the narrow alleyways, carrying with it the cool scent of stone that had released the warmth of yesterday. His small home was modest. The floor beneath his feet was made of smooth stone, cool even during summer. The walls were plain plaster, worn by many seasons. Nothing was luxurious. Nothing needed to be. A simple oil lamp waited beside his bed. He reached for it almost without thinking. A flint struck gently. A tiny spark appeared. For a brief moment, the darkness hesitated. Then a small golden flame awakened inside the clay lamp, painting soft shadows across the room. The light was warm rather than bright, enough to see, enough to begin another ordinary day. He dressed quietly, a plain wool tunic, a leather belt, simple sandals waiting by the doorway. Every movement was familiar. There was no rush. The bread would not rise faster because he hurried. The oven would not grow hotter because he worried. So he moved slowly, deliberately. Outside, the sky remained almost completely black. Above Rome stretched countless stars, brighter than most people today have ever seen. Without electric lights, the heavens seemed endless. The Milky Way flowed gently overhead like pale dust scattered across dark velvet. For a brief moment, the baker paused outside his door. He breathed deeply. The cool morning air filled his lungs. It smelled of damp stone, distant smoke, olive wood, and quiet. Soon enough, the city would awaken. Thousands of footsteps, voices, animals, market stalls, children laughing, blacksmiths hammering, merchants bargaining. But not yet. For these few precious moments, Rome belonged only to those who rose before everyone else. The baker smiled softly to himself. Then, carrying his small lamp, he began walking through the sleeping streets toward the bakery, where another day and another 100 loaves were waiting. The bakery stood only a short walk from his home. The streets were still wrapped in darkness. Only the soft glow of his little oil lamp danced across the ancient stones beneath his feet. When he reached the heavy wooden door, he paused for a moment. His hand rested gently upon the worn handle. It felt familiar, just as it had every morning for many years. He pushed the door open. The quiet bakery welcomed him. Inside, the air was cool. The great clay oven stood silently in the corner, waiting for another day. Without fire, it looked almost asleep. The baker set his lamp upon the wooden table. Its small flame painted warm circles of light across sacks of flour, smooth clay bowls, and shelves lined with woven baskets. Everything was exactly where he had left it the evening before. He smiled. There is comfort in familiar places. He knelt beside the oven. Yesterday's ashes still rested inside, gray, soft, silent. Using a small wooden brush, he carefully swept them into a clay bucket. There was no hurry. A clean oven was the beginning of good bread. From a neat stack beside the wall, he selected several pieces of dry olive wood. Not too large, not too small. He knew from experience exactly how each piece would burn. One by one, he placed them inside. A twist of dried straw, a handful of kindling, another careful strike of flint. For a heartbeat, nothing happened. Then, a tiny orange flame appeared. It flickered gently, almost shy. The baker leaned forward and breathed softly. The little flame answered, growing stronger, brighter, warmer. Soon the fire began its quiet conversation with the oven. The dry wood crackled softly. Tiny sparks danced upward before disappearing into the darkness above. The scent of warm olive wood slowly filled the room. It was a smell the baker had known since childhood, one that meant another peaceful day had begun. He sat beside the oven for a while, simply watching the fire grow. Some things could never be hurried. Not bread, not fire, not morning. Outside, the first birds had begun to sing. The sky was still dark, but somewhere beyond the eastern hills, the sun was preparing to rise. The baker stretched out his hands toward the growing warmth. The chill of the night slowly disappeared from his fingers. Soon, the oven would be ready. Soon, flour would become dough. And before long, the first fragrance of fresh bread would drift through the streets of Rome, welcoming the city into another ordinary, beautiful day. The fire was growing steadily now. The great clay oven no longer seemed cold and silent. It breathed with quiet warmth. The baker knew there was still time before the stones inside reached the perfect temperature. So he turned toward the long wooden table where the day's work truly began. A large clay bowl waited patiently. Its smooth sides had been dusted with flour thousands of times before. Generations of bread had begun in bowls much like this one. From a linen sack, he lifted handful after handful of finely ground wheat flour. Soft white clouds drifted into the warm air before gently settling once more. The flour felt cool against his hands, silky, dry, almost weightless. Next came water, not hot, not cold, just warm enough to welcome the sleeping yeast back to life. He poured it slowly, watching little streams disappear into the flour. A pinch of sea salt followed. Nothing more. Roman bread was simple, only a few humble ingredients. Yet when treated with patience, they became something remarkable. The baker rested both hands inside the bowl. For a moment, he did nothing. He simply felt the mixture beneath his fingers. Cool flour, warm water, tiny grains of salt. Then slowly he began to stir. Round and round. Gentle circles at first. The dry flour slowly welcomed the water. Little by little, loose powder became soft clumps. The clumps became one large mass. The familiar rhythm began. Push, fold, turn, again. Push, fold, turn. The bakery remained wonderfully quiet. Only the gentle scrape of dough against clay, the soft crackling of the oven, and the distant songs of waking birds filled the morning air. Time seemed to slow. There was no clock to watch, no list to hurry through, only the quiet certainty that good bread could never be rushed. As the dough grew smoother beneath his palms, the baker smiled, almost without noticing. He had made this same movement thousands of mornings. His hands no longer thought about what to do. They simply remembered. Outside, the darkness had begun to soften. A faint silver light touched the rooftops of Rome. Another day was quietly arriving. Inside the bakery, the dough had become smooth and elastic, soft, warm, alive. The baker gently covered the bowl with a clean linen cloth. Now, it was the dough's turn to work, and while it rested peacefully, the city beyond the bakery walls was beginning to wake. The linen cloth rested gently over the bowl. Beneath it, the dough slowly awakened. Tiny bubbles formed where no one could see them. The yeast quietly did its work. There was nothing for the baker to do except wait. He had learned long ago that patience was one of the most important ingredients in every loaf. Outside, dawn finally arrived. The first rays of sunlight reached the highest rooftops of Rome. Golden light slowly spilled into the narrow streets. The city stretched itself awake. Wooden shutters opened one by one. A distant rooster called from somewhere beyond the houses. The sound echoed softly through the neighborhood. Soon came the footsteps. One pair, then another. A cart rolled across the worn stone road, its wooden wheels rumbling gently. Somewhere nearby, a donkey gave a sleepy bray. A woman greeted her neighbor. Someone laughed quietly. Rome was waking. Inside the bakery, the oven glowed with steady heat. The baker uncovered the bowl. The dough had nearly doubled in size. He smiled with quiet satisfaction, just as he had hoped. He dusted the table lightly with flour, then turned the dough onto the smooth wooden surface. It landed with a soft, gentle sound. Carefully, he divided it into smaller pieces. Each one would become a loaf. His hands moved with calm precision. Not one piece was exactly the same, yet each felt right, round, smooth, balanced. He rolled each loaf beneath his palms until its surface became soft and tight. Then he placed them into woven baskets, lined with clean cloth. They would rest one final time before meeting the heat of the oven. As he worked, the familiar scent of warm wood filled the room. Soon another fragrance joined it, the sweet, comforting smell of rising bread. People passing outside began to notice. Some slowed their steps. Others smiled as they walked by. Fresh bread had a way of announcing itself before a single loaf had been baked. A little boy paused outside the doorway. He peeked inside with wide, curious eyes. The baker looked up and smiled. The boy smiled back. Neither of them spoke. There was no need. The smell of bread said enough. In another hour, the shelves would be full. By midday, many of them would already be empty. But for now, the bakery remained peaceful, filled with warm light, gentle silence, and the quiet promise of another ordinary morning in ancient Rome. By now, the bakery was fully awake. The fire glowed deep within the clay oven. Its warmth filled every corner of the room. The first loaves were ready. The baker gently lifted each one from its basket. The dough had become light beneath his hands, soft, springy, full of tiny pockets of air. He placed each loaf onto a long wooden peel dusted with flour. For a brief moment, he admired them. Simple, round, honest. Then, with one smooth motion, He slid the first loaf into the hot oven. Another followed, then another. Soon the oven held an entire morning's work. The heavy door closed. Now, there was only waiting. The baker stood quietly beside the warmth of the fire. He listened. Bread speaks in its own quiet language. The soft crackle of the wood, the whisper of steam escaping from the dough, the gentle shifting of the burning logs. These sounds told him everything he needed to know. Outside, Rome had become lively. Merchants arranged baskets of fruit. Fish sellers called to early customers. A blacksmith's hammer rang somewhere across the neighborhood. Children hurried through the streets, carrying small clay jugs for their families. Life had begun. Before long, the first customer entered the bakery, an elderly woman wrapped in a simple wool shawl. She smiled before saying a single word. The smell of fresh bread had greeted her before the baker had. "Good morning," she said softly. "And to you," the baker replied. She chose a warm, round loaf, still carrying the heat of the oven. The baker wrapped it carefully in a clean linen cloth before placing it into her waiting hands. She thanked him with a smile. The smell of warm bread followed her back into the street. Soon, another customer arrived. Then another. A young father buying bread before work. A grandmother choosing 2 small loaves. A soldier collecting breakfast on his way to the city gate. A little girl carefully counting her family's coins before reaching the counter. The baker treated each person exactly the same. With patience, with kindness, with quiet respect. To him, bread was never simply food. It was comfort. It was routine. It was something every family carried home each morning. As the hours passed, the wooden shelves slowly became emptier. Each space left behind told the same story. Another loaf had found its table. Another family would gather to share it. The bakery remained warm, peaceful, filled with gentle conversation and the comforting fragrance of crusty bread cooling on wooden racks. The baker looked around the room. There was still work to do. Always more bread to bake. Always another customer waiting. And somehow, he would not have wished for any other life. By the time the sun climbed higher into the Roman sky, the morning rush had begun to fade. The bakery grew quiet once again. Only a handful of warm loaves remained upon the wooden shelves. The baker brushed the flour from his hands and stepped outside. The streets had changed completely since before dawn. Where silence had once lived, the city now hummed with gentle life. Merchants stood beneath colorful cloth awnings. Wooden carts overflowed with ripe figs, grapes, onions, garlic, and fragrant herbs. Large baskets held olives of every shade, from bright green to deep purple. Nearby, a cheese seller carefully sliced fresh rounds from large wheels resting on polished wooden boards. The warm air carried countless familiar scents: fresh bread, rosemary, olive oil, honey, ripe fruit warmed by the morning sun. Someone nearby roasted chestnuts over glowing coals. Their sweet aroma drifted lazily through the marketplace. The baker greeted people as he walked, a potter carrying newly fired bowls, a farmer leading a patient donkey, a fisherman returning from the river. Many knew him, not because he was important, but because nearly every family had visited his bakery at one time or another. A smile was exchanged, a nod, a few quiet words, nothing hurried, nothing forced. The marketplace itself seemed almost like a conversation. No single voice tried to rise above the others. Instead, hundreds of ordinary sounds blended into one peaceful rhythm. Footsteps across ancient stone, children laughing as they chased one another between market stalls, the flutter of pigeons taking flight, the gentle clink of clay cups, the rustle of woven baskets being lifted and set down again. The baker paused beside a man selling fresh olive oil. The merchant carefully poured a little into a shallow clay dish. Golden, smooth. It caught the sunlight like liquid amber. The baker dipped a small piece of warm bread into the oil. Nothing more was needed. The bread was still soft inside. Its crust crackled gently with every bite. Simple food, made with care, shared without hurry. For a few peaceful moments he stood quietly beneath the warm Roman sun, watching the marketplace continue its slow and steady dance. There were no grand events unfolding, no famous names passing through the crowd. Only ordinary people living ordinary lives. And perhaps that was the true heart of Rome. Not the marble temples, not the triumphal arches, not the palaces upon distant hills, but places like this, where neighbors greeted one another, where children laughed, where bread was broken and shared, and where another beautiful day quietly unfolded, one simple moment at a time. As the afternoon settled over the city, the marketplace slowly grew quieter. Many families had returned home. Shopkeepers sat beneath the shade of woven awnings. Even the animals seemed content to rest for a while beneath the warm summer sun. Back inside the bakery, peace returned once again. Only the gentle warmth of the oven remained. The busiest hours had passed. Fresh loaves cooled upon wooden racks. Their golden crusts crackled softly as they released the last of their steam. The baker loved this sound. It was quiet, almost impossible to hear unless one stood nearby. Yet to him, it was the sound of work well done. He walked slowly along the shelves, gently turning each loaf so it would cool evenly. The scent filling the bakery was unlike anything else. Warm wheat, toasted crust, a hint of olive wood smoke. It was a smell that settled into the walls themselves after many years. Even after the last loaf had been sold, visitors often said the bakery still smelled like fresh bread. Perhaps it always would. Sunlight entered through the open doorway in long, golden beams. Tiny particles of flour floated lazily through the light. They drifted so slowly they almost seemed to stand still. The baker wiped the wooden table clean. He brushed loose flour into a small basket. Nothing was wasted. Even the smallest scraps of dough would later become simple flatbreads for his own evening meal. Outside, the sounds of Rome softened. A cart rolled past at an unhurried pace. Somewhere nearby, someone played a simple tune on a reed flute. Its melody floated through the warm afternoon air before disappearing into the narrow streets. The baker paused for a moment. He leaned lightly against the doorway, watching people pass. A mother holding her child's hand. An old man carrying vegetables home from the market. Two young apprentices laughing quietly as they hurried back to their workshop. Nobody seemed to notice the passing of time. And perhaps that was the greatest gift of ordinary days. They asked for nothing extraordinary, only attention. The baker took a slow breath. The scent of bread, warm stone, summer air, olive trees somewhere beyond the city walls. For a brief moment, everything felt perfectly complete. No grand celebration, no remarkable event, just another peaceful afternoon in a little bakery in the heart of ancient Rome. The afternoon slowly gave way to evening. The bright sunlight softened into a gentle golden glow. Long shadows stretched across the streets of Rome. The day's warmth still lingered in the stone walls, but the air had begun to cool. Back inside the bakery, Only a few loaves remained. The busiest hours were over. Most of the shelves now stood empty. The baker smiled quietly as he looked around. Empty shelves were never disappointing. They meant the bread had found its way to waiting tables, to families gathering for supper, to children returning from play, to travelers ending a long day's journey. He carefully swept the floor. Every movement was slow, almost peaceful. A broom whispered across the smooth stone. Small traces of flour disappeared into a wooden bucket. The clay bowls were washed with cool water. The wooden table was wiped clean. Tomorrow, before dawn, everything would begin again. The fire inside the great oven was no longer roaring. Only glowing embers remained. Soft, orange, steady. They gave off a gentle warmth that filled the bakery with quiet comfort. The baker sat on a simple wooden stool beside the oven. For the first time all day, there was nothing left to do. He rested his hands upon his knees, closed his eyes for a moment, and simply listened. The crackling embers, a distant bird calling from a rooftop, the faint murmur of neighbors speaking somewhere beyond the open door. Nothing more, nothing less. These ordinary sounds had become part of his life for so many years that he could hardly imagine a day without them. Outside, the streets grew calmer. Children who had spent the afternoon laughing now walked home beside their parents. Merchants folded their cloth awnings. Wooden carts disappeared one by one into narrow side streets. The marketplace slowly surrendered to the coming night. The baker stood once more. He gently closed the heavy wooden shutters. The last golden rays of sunlight slipped through the narrow gaps before disappearing completely. Inside, only the warm glow of the embers remained. The bakery felt smaller now, quieter, almost as though it too were growing sleepy after a long day's work. The baker smiled softly. Tomorrow, before the stars had faded, before the city had awakened, before the first birds greeted the morning, he would return, and the oven, patiently waiting in the darkness, would come to life once again. The walk home was never a long one. The baker knew every stone along the narrow streets, every corner, every doorway, every little garden where herbs grew in clay pots beneath open windows. The city had begun to settle for the night. The busiest sounds had faded. Even the donkeys that had carried heavy loads throughout the day now rested quietly beside their stables. The evening breeze drifted gently through the streets. It carried the scent of warm stone that had spent the entire day beneath the Roman sun. The baker reached his small home just as the sky began to glow with the deep colors of sunset. Soft gold, gentle amber, hints of rose and violet above the distant hills. He opened the wooden door. Inside, the room welcomed him with peaceful silence. Nothing grand awaited him, only the simple comforts that had always been enough. He lit another small oil lamp. Its quiet flame filled the room with warm, golden light. The shadows upon the walls began to dance softly. He placed one fresh loaf upon the table. Its crust still crackled ever so slightly. Beside it, he arranged a small clay bowl filled with green olives, a wedge of sheep's cheese, a handful of ripe figs gathered only that morning, a little dish of fragrant olive oil. Nothing extravagant, yet everything prepared with care. He tore a piece of warm bread with his hands. The soft steam still rose from the center. He dipped it into the olive oil, then enjoyed it slowly. There was no need to hurry. The day had already given him everything it intended to give. Outside, Voices became fewer. A child laughed somewhere in the distance before being called gently inside. A wooden door closed. Footsteps passed, then disappeared. The city was slowly preparing for sleep. The baker poured himself a cup of cool water from a clay jug. The water had remained surprisingly fresh despite the summer warmth. He sat quietly, eating little by little, watching the gentle flame of the oil lamp. Sometimes the greatest luxury was simply having enough. Enough bread, enough work, enough peace. When the meal was finished, he gathered the dishes without haste. Tomorrow would arrive soon enough. There was no reason to borrow tomorrow's worries while tonight remained so calm. He stepped outside once more. The last colors of sunset had almost disappeared. Above him, the first stars quietly returned to the Roman sky. Night settled gently over the city. One by one, the windows grew dark. The last merchants had long since returned home. The busy streets that had carried thousands of footsteps throughout the day slowly surrendered to silence. Only a few oil lamps still glowed beside doorways. Their tiny flames flickered softly whenever the evening breeze wandered through the narrow streets. The baker stood for a while beneath the open sky. He had done this for many years, not because anyone expected him to, but because he enjoyed these quiet moments before sleep. Above him stretched a sky filled with countless stars. Without bright city lights, they seemed almost close enough to touch. The Milky Way spread across the heavens like a pale river, flowing silently through the darkness. Somewhere beyond the rooftops, an owl called into the night. Its lonely voice drifted across the sleeping city before fading into the distance. The baker smiled. Rome was never truly silent. Even at night, the city breathed. Somewhere, water flowed through ancient aqueducts. Somewhere, the night watch quietly walked its familiar route. Somewhere, a mother gently rocked her child asleep. Somewhere, another baker, in another neighborhood, had already begun preparing for tomorrow. Life never truly stopped. It simply became quieter. He took one last slow breath. The cool night air carried the faint scent of olive trees beyond the city walls. The warmth of the day had disappeared. In its place came a peaceful stillness that wrapped itself around the streets like a soft blanket. The baker returned inside. He carefully closed the wooden door. The small oil lamp beside his bed still burned with a calm, golden flame. He sat for a moment at its side, not thinking about tomorrow, not counting yesterday, simply enjoying the quiet. He gently blew across the flame. It trembled, once, twice, then disappeared. Darkness filled the room once more. Outside, Rome continued dreaming beneath the stars. Tomorrow, before the first bird welcomed the morning, before the marketplace stirred, before the ovens glowed, the baker would wake again, and another ordinary day would quietly become another small piece of history. Good night, my friend. May your sleep be as peaceful as this quiet evening in ancient Rome. And so, our little journey comes to an end. The fire beside us has burned a little lower now. Its flames no longer dance as brightly. Instead, they glow softly, painting warm shadows across the room. Somewhere beyond the firelight, ancient Rome has completely fallen asleep. The bakery is quiet. The oven has grown cool. The streets that only hours ago echoed with footsteps now rest beneath a blanket of stars. The baker sleeps peacefully. His work is finished. His hands, which shaped so many loaves before sunrise, are finally still. Tomorrow, Before the dawn returns, he will rise once again. He will light the fire, mix the dough, welcome familiar faces, and another ordinary day will quietly become another forgotten page of history. Perhaps that is one of history's greatest secrets. Most lives are never written into books. Most names are never carved into stone. Yet every ordinary person leaves behind something meaningful: a loaf of bread, a kind word, a helping hand, a warm meal shared with family, small moments, quiet moments, the kind that rarely survive through centuries, yet somehow are the ones that truly shape the world. As our own fire grows softer, allow your thoughts to grow quieter too. There is nowhere left to travel tonight, nothing left to imagine, nothing waiting for you except peaceful rest. If sleep has already found you, then I wish you the gentlest of dreams. And if you're still listening, thank you for spending this quiet evening beside the fire with me. Until our paths meet again, good night, my friend. Sleep well.